Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we are joined by Nina, and we are going to be making some cookies. Nina, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for hanging out with me today. Today we are going to make some cookies, and it is very close to Mother's Day, so this would be a great thing that you could make ahead of time for any of the mothers in your life. You can make them the day of with your own mom if you want to, or you can make them really any time of the year. So this is kind of a really cool recipe. We call these actually secret ingredient cookies. So there's ingredient in this cookie that you wouldn't normally think to put into it. And I promise you that the cookies still taste good. So I'm just gonna go over what we need right before we get started, and then I'll kind of walk you through the whole process. So you're going to need either a stand mixer or a hand mixer to be able to mix the dough together. We're going to need sugar, some butter. We're going to need vanilla. The recipe also calls for some almond extract, but you can just use vanilla extract, which is what I'm doing today. Our secret ingredient is actually white beans. So you can use I can never say this word, cannellini beans, or you could also use northern white beans, whichever you prefer. You just want to make sure that you have some sort of a white bean because this is our secret ingredient. You're going to need eggs, 2 eggs. We'll need some salt, some baking powder, and flour. And then of course, to make the cookies, we're also going to use a rolling pin. We're going to have some cookie cutters. I have frosting already that I bought from the store, but you could obviously make your own frosting if you want to as well. You're going to need a big baking pan, and I have parchment paper on mine, but you can just use a pan with spray on it as well. Okay, so we're going to get started. We're going to get started first with the batter. And so before we actually make the batter, the first thing we need to do is we need to make our bean puree. So the white beans are going to add some protein and fiber to this recipe. That is something that you don't typically get in a cookie. And it's just kind of a fun way to use something that we typically have in our pantry that we would have never thought of before. And so we need to puree these beans. We need about a half of a cup of puree. So I've got this little food chopper processor here. If you have a blender, you can use the blender as well. If you have a bigger food processor, you could use that too, but we're going to do about a half a cup. And you can do the whole can of beans if you want to. These beans should be rinsed underwater, so you're going to open the can and rinse them really good before you put them into your food processor. You might have to have a couple of times where you get it in there where it kind of really purees, and depending on your specific device that you're using, you might have to do it a couple of times. Like this might need to take just a little bit out of there to make sure that it really kind of pops it up in there for me. Okay. So you want to get a good amount of those beans in there, nice and pureed if you can. Mine might be a little bit chunky, but it's not going to really matter too much in the dough because we're going to work the dough together really well. The other thing you can do is if your bean puree doesn't come together as well as you like, you could always add in a little bit of water, which I think is what I'm going to do. In the past, when I've made these, I've always made them in a little bit of a bigger of a food processor. So I think trying it out in this little guy probably didn't work as well as I wanted to, but that's cooking, right? You just never know how things are going to go. That's much better. So sometimes you just have to kind of go with the flow. All right, so I'm going to use this. I take my little blade out of there, put in my dirty dish bin, and we are going to use 1/2 a cup. Here. 1/2 a cup of the bean puree. So I'm going to measure that out into my 1/2 cup measuring spoon here. This might be almost just about a 1/2 cup. This is perfect. Now you can save, if you pureed all of the beans, you can save that mixture for another dish if you'd like. You can actually also look up on the internet, there's frosting that you can make as well using a bean puree as well. So if you wanted to kind of get adventurous and make the frosting out of beans also, you could totally do that. So we're going to add the bean puree to the stand mixer or the bowl if you're using a hand mixer. And then to that, we are going to add our butter. So we have a half a cup of unsalted butter. So that's typically about 1 stick of butter. Mine's already here. I just cut it up a little bit. You don't have to do that. You can just unroll it just like you normally would. And we're going to put that right in with our bean puree. And then to that, we are also going to add 1 cup of sugar. You want to make sure when you're doing your sugar that you are leveling it out. Good. So I have a knife out because sometimes I use that for my sugar and my flour. This looks like it's pretty simple. So 1 cup of sugar, gonna go right into there. We are gonna puree, or we are gonna add that to our mixer, and we are gonna mix that together until it kind of comes together. We want this mixture to be well mixed. So you'll start off slow and then just start speeding it up little by little until it starts to come together. Starting to look good. Okay, so to that, once it's well mixed, we're actually going to add 2 eggs and we're going to incorporate those pretty well. So I usually like to add 1 at a time. If you want to, you can crack an egg into a small bowl first if you want, especially if you're learning how. I'm just going to go ahead and crack that 1 egg right into the mixer. And I'm just going to keep mine on and I'm going to crack the 2nd egg while it's mixing. You might have to at some point stop and just give the sides a good little scrape. I usually only do this about 1 time beforehand. So I'm going to scrape the sides. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add our vanilla. So we're going to add 1.5 teaspoons. So I have a 1/2 teaspoon scoop. So you'll see me add 3 spoonfuls. And then if you wanted to add the almond extract is only a 1/4 teaspoon. So it's not very much, but if you wanted to add it, you absolutely could at this time. We're going to mix it together 1 more time. Okay, so that should come together pretty well for you, kind of soupy looking. And what we're going to do next then is we are going to mix together our dry ingredients. And so we're going to do this first, and then we're going to add it to our wet ingredients in little batches. So we need baking powder. You're going to need salt. We're going to, and our flour. That's going to be our three dry ingredients. And so, wait, my spatula. You're also probably going to want like a whisk or a spatula or a spoon of some sort to kind of mix it together before we put it into the bowl. So for your baking powder, you're going to need 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Make sure that it is baking powder and not baking soda. They both have very, very different properties when baking. So we don't want the baking soda, not for this recipe at least. And then we're also going to do 1 teaspoon of salt in there. And then finally, we are going to add our flour. Now you're going to need a lot of this today, not only just with putting it into the actual cookies, but we're going to be using it here in a few minutes to actually do the rolling out. So you're going to need 3.5 cups of flour. So I've got my big 1 cup, and I'm going to make sure that I level that off really nicely. I'm going to add 1 cup. Going for my second full cup here of flour. And then we are going to add in the last full cup. This is number 3, flour. It's okay, you can get a little bit of flour everywhere because in a few minutes we're going to have flour all over anyway, because we are going to be making our cookies. And then you're going to do your 1/2 cup of flour. So remember, we need 3.5 cups. So I've got my 1/2 cup here. I'm going to level off that flour and put that in there. So quite a bit of flour we have going on there. And I'm just going to take my spatula really quick and just kind of mix it together to kind of incorporate the salt that was on the bottom and that baking powder that was on the bottom in there together. So now what we're going to do is we are going to add the dry ingredients to the wet ingredients in stages. So I'm going to be filling up my 1/2 cup, and I'm just going to be adding it to the mixer as it's on and kind of making sure that it just kind of mixes in. I might have to stop it each time only because my mixer is a little different. It doesn't have a lot of room. So I'm going to open it up and add probably about a cup of my dry ingredients to there. Click it in, we're going to turn it on and get that mixing. You always want to start slow when you just added flour in, because if you go really high at first, the flour is just going to go poof, and it's going to go everywhere. Once you see the flour start to mix in, that's when you're going to add your next little batch. We're going to do probably about another cup or so right in there. And again, we're going to start it slow. Turn it gradually up. Get it mixed in there. What's going to happen is we're going to start to see a dough really come together, and I can see it come together already. We're going to do some of the mixing here. If you're using a hand mixer, you're going to do the same process. You're just going to mix in the flour little bits at a time into the bowl that you're using. And eventually, we're going to end up using our hands. So you do want to make sure that your hands have been washed. Getting a little bit harder for my mixer to mix it, which means the dough is really coming together. All right, last little bit here. You can kind of see the dough kind of coming up here. Bring this little guy in, kind of see, really getting some dough in there. We got all the rest of the flour in there. And get it back down in there and get that mixed in as well as we can. Now, I'm just going to kind of see how it does. We may have to bring the dough out and finish it by hand. And it kind of looks like that's what's happening. And that's okay. So you're going to kind of have to play it by ear. I'm going to actually take the dough off of my thing here. So what we're going to do is we are going to, at least, if your mixer is working really well, keep going until the dough pulls together. Every time I make this recipe, sometimes I think it's completely different. I've made it several times. And sometimes my mixer works really well, and other times my mixer needs a little bit of help. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to mix by hand. And so you're going to want to take a little bit of flour. You can use a cutting board if you want to do your rolling out on. I'm actually going to put mine to the side. I like to use the countertop. So I have cleaned this countertop really well. I just think that it works a little bit easier for me. I'm going to put some flour out on the countertop. This is where it really gets fun. This is where we get to learn how to and work with the dough. So you're going to take the dough that you just have there, and we're going to kind of take this, we're going to mix it together. So mine's still a little bit in pieces. But as it comes out, as I pull it out here, which you'll see here in a minute, it's going to start working together. We're going to start incorporating a little bit more of that flour into the dough. And again, if your mixer did a really great job and it just mixed it all together, that's perfect. But you know, there were times where mixers weren't even a thing, right? We didn't have electricity, so we had to use our hands. We had to use our arms and our muscles. And so even if this is the way that we have to bring the dough together, that's going to be totally fine. I actually really like it, feel like it. Makes me feel like I'm really baking if I'm able to kind of get in there and work with my hands. Now you're going to want to make sure that you keep the dough in some of that flour, because otherwise it's going to stick to the countertop. Okay, and so what we're doing here is we're just working this dough into a nice dough until it comes together. So almost there. Okay. So you can kind of see, give me a nice little round ball that's come together. And nobody will know that this dough also has beans in it, right? Nobody except for us. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start rolling out and we're going to start making our cookies. So I'm going to clean up my space here just a little bit since I want to make sure you guys can see everything we're doing. So I have my sheet pan nearby, and I did forget to tell you guys, you want to make sure that your oven is preheating to 400 degrees. So my oven is already on at 400 degrees. So if you haven't done that already, if you're cooking with me in real time, definitely make sure you get that oven on to preheating to 400 degrees. You're also going to want to make sure you have some sort of cookie cutters. So I have a little butterfly, I have a little flower, another little flower. I also have these fun little circles. I might do a couple of little circles here and there just to kind of play around and see, because you never know, you could make some really fun decorations with circles. So now what we're going to do is you're going to need a rolling pin, and we're just going to roll the dough out. So we want to roll the dough out to about 1/3 of an inch. I'll kind of show you what that looks like. You can kind of see, you may be able to see it in your dough, not sure, but I can kind of see little bits and pieces of the beans in there. Now, I only can tell just because I know what we put into the dough, right? But again, if you're making this for your mom, your aunt, your grandma, your sister, whoever, they won't have any idea that there were beans in there, unless you're going to spill the beans, literally. You want to make sure you keep some flour on hand or on your cutting board to make sure that it doesn't stick to the cutting board or stick too much to the cutting board or the rolling pin or to the counter if you're doing it like I am. So you want to really get this first one out to about an inch. I think I'm probably right about there at a good width. Okay, so now we're going to start taking those cookie cutters. You can go ahead and make those, and I'll kind of show you. This is about how thin I have the cookies. You can kind of see that. So we're going to go ahead and put those. Once you have the cookies, go all the way around and just kind of start cutting out the cookies just as you'd like. And we're going to get those onto our baking pan. Now these cookies are going to bake in the oven for about 6 minutes, or until the undersides of the cookies start to get a little brown or a little golden brown. We don't want them completely done, right? So we want to just kind of keep an eye on them and see how well they do. So I'll kind of be able to show you what that finished product looks like, because we're going to make a couple sets of cookies here together. Now, if you're really adventurous in the kitchen, you could always make your own frosting. That is something that I've done, and actually, so I've made these cookies many a times in my kids' cooking classes. I have done it before where we have made the cookies out of the beans and also the frosting out of the beans too. We've also done it where we have made the cookies out of the beans. And then the frosting, we actually use 2 other secret ingredients. So I'm going to tell you about that here in just a second. So I have all of my cookies here on my baking sheet. You might be able to fit more on yours depending on how big your cookie cutters are or how big your sheet is. I'm going to get this into my oven again for about 6 minutes so I can show you what the finished product looks like. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to cut some of these big shapes or big cookies out. And I just have a cookie cutter, or not a cookie cutter, a cutting board over here on the side that I'm going to go ahead and put some of those extras on. Now, the frosting that I made in one of my other cooking classes that had secret ingredients was we actually dyed the frosting. And we dyed them 2 colors. We dyed one green and one pink. And we were able to do that using vegetables. And I know that might sound so silly, but it was really cool. Now, before I keep going on that, once you have no more room to really do any more stencils, what you can do is just take all of that, all of your little scraps for your dough again. We're just going to bring it together, and you're just going to go ahead and mold all of that into a ball again. And we're just going to do that again until we have very little of our dough. You can kind of see. This is a really great recipe too. Parents, especially if you're following along, if you have multiple kids, each kid can get a little bit of the dough and make their own cookies too. So not everybody in the family has to work off of one big ball of dough where you have to make the recipe 2 or 3 different times. You can make this recipe once, and if you have a couple of kids, each kid can get a portion of the dough, because what you're going to see is that you're going to be able to roll out this dough at least 2 to 3 times, if not 3 to 4, depending on how thick you're making those cookies. Now, if your cookies are a little bit thicker than 1/3 of an inch, that just means you might have to cook them a little bit longer. That's all. I'm going to do a couple circles. So for that one recipe I mentioned, we did vegetables as our coloring for our frosting. So for green, we actually used spinach. So we just blended up spinach, about 3 cups of spinach in a blender with, I think, about a cup of water. And then what we did is we strained that mixture through a strainer. And that gave us a really pretty green color without any of the extra little bits of spinach in it. And we added that to a tub of white frosting, like we'll be using here today. So you could take a tub of white frosting like this, you could divide it in half. And if you were going to make a green one with the spinach, you could just add a couple of teaspoons to that to get the desired color that you wanted. Now to make the pink, that one was a little bit of extra steps. So for that one, what we did was we took a beet. If you've never had a beet before, beets are this beautiful, beautiful pink, especially in the middle. And so what we did was we peeled a beet and we chopped it up and we put it in some water and we boiled it for a little bit. And I think it was for about 20 or so minutes that we boiled that beet. And then once that was done, we did the same thing like we did with our spinach. And we took that beet and we strained the mixture through another strainer. And that gave us this beautiful pink color. And we did the same thing like we did with the spinach, where we took our white frosting and we went ahead and added a few tablespoons of food coloring, whichever color you like, and that colored our frosting. And you're probably wondering, well, why would I want to color my frosting naturally like that with spinach or beets? And before you say ew, I promise that the frosting did not taste like spinach and it did not taste like beets at all. Now, the reason that we did that was because it was just a natural way to do a dye. Some kids can't have dyes for health reasons, and so it was nice to be able to show other kids and adults too that you don't necessarily have to buy food coloring if you want to be able to dye your frosting for cookies or cakes or cupcakes or whatever it is that you might be cooking. So just an idea if you're looking for something fun maybe to do this summer, especially after you've tried this recipe. Now this is probably my 4th time now, I think, taking the dough and going through and making more cookies. So you can kind of see this one batch of dough is going to be perfect for either a couple of kids to make a few cookies off of, or it's going to be great for getting several batches of cookies. Eventually, you're going to get down though to a small amount where we just kind of call that the end cookie, where you just put it all together in one big ball. And that's kind of what we end up doing. Or in my other cooking classes that I've had before, the kids get super creative and you can kind of take the dough and you could take like a little butter knife or a cookie cutter, or not cookie cutter, a pizza cutter, and you could make lines and you could get really creative. And maybe you could make a message for mom or make a message for somebody if it's their birthday out of cookie and say happy birthday or I love you, or you can make your own little heart. So really it's endless when you get down to the little scraps here of the cookie dough of what you could do. Especially, this is probably the littlest amount that's really left. You could take something like this and get really creative and make your own fun little thing. I'm not going to get too creative today. I'm just going to kind of press it down into a little bit of a bigger cookie. And that's going to be all we'll have left of the dough. So maybe probably about a couple dozen cookies. I've got, all of my extras here on my cutting board. And I just heard the ding and I can start to smell them too. It sounds like our cookies are probably done. So I'll show you here. They've nice and puffed up. I'm probably going to leave them in for probably another minute or two because they're not too brown on the edges just yet. So just kind of keep that in mind. Once your cookies are all done cooking, what you want to do is you want to put them somewhere where they can cool. You want them to cool down for at least an hour or so. I know it's hard. You just want to eat them right away. If you want to, you could definitely frost your own and eat it right away. But if you are making these for somebody in your family, you're going to want to make sure that you let them cool down first before you add your frosting. If you don't, what's going to happen is the frosting is going to melt and it's going to be one gooey mess. So wait about an hour, let them cool down. You can frost them either by putting the frosting in like a Ziploc bag like this and cutting off a corner. You can kind of squeeze a design on there if you want to, or you can either, if you're old enough or somebody in your family can help you, use like a butter knife and help spread it on each of the cookies. And then the fun part is you could easily add some sprinkles on top too. So either of those options would be really great. Nobody's going to know that these cookies have a secret ingredient. And I promise that they're going to be super delicious and a fun thing that you can take to either the mothers in your life this Mother's Day or for any other type of celebration as well in the future. So thank you so much for cooking with me today. And I hope you guys enjoy these delicious cookies.
Thank you so much for showing us how to cook these awesome cookies, and I am really excited to try the recipe. Thank you everybody for watching. If you want to see more of our programs, go to rivervalleylibrary.org and check out our events page. Nina, do you have any other cooking classes coming up?
We have a couple cooking classes coming up in May of this month. They are for gluten-free cooking. So we're going to be doing a couple of gluten-free recipes. We also do cooking classes for kids every month. So you can find out those dates and more information by visiting Hy-Vee.com/help.
Awesome. Well, thank you again and have a good day.
Thank you, you too.